There is a certain age a woman reaches when she finally understands which stories are worth telling in full, and which are better left folded away like old linens, taken out only on the quietest of evenings. This is one I have chosen to tell completely, because I believe it is less a story about dukes and disguises than it is about something far more ordinary and far more precious: the slow, patient work of learning to trust another person's heart, even after that heart has once disappointed you. I have gone back over that morning so many times in my mind that it hardly feels like a memory anymore. It feels like something I watched happen to another woman, from far away, through a pane of glass. The square was thick with mud after 3 days of rain, and that mud was suddenly full of gold, because that is what it looked like when the king's guard knelt down in it. 12 men in polished armor, their capes soaked black at the hem, going down on one knee in the filth of our own town square as if the ground itself were the floor of a palace. The chickens scattered from under their boots. Old Muriel's washing hung forgotten on the line above them, as though even the laundry had stopped to stare. And in the middle of that circle of kneeling men stood Arthur. My Arthur. There was still soot on his forearms, the same arms that had carried water buckets for me all summer. A burn scar, healed now to a soft pink, marked his left palm, the very palm I had bandaged myself, months before, in a smithy that smelled of coal smoke and honey and him. He did not look like a man being rescued. He looked like a man who had been caught, and who was only now realizing how much he had come to love the thing he'd taken. I stood at the edge of the crowd with a basket of bread going cold in my arms, and I understood, all at once, that the man I had given my heart to had never truly existed, not the way I had known him, and that the real man, the one those guards called Your Grace, was about to lose me, whether he understood that yet or not. But I am getting ahead of myself, and a broken heart is never the best one to tell a story straight through. Let me start where it truly began, weeks earlier, with a stranger who arrived at old Tomas's forge with the wrong hands entirely for the trade he claimed to want. The first time I laid eyes on Arthur, he was doing a poor job of holding a blacksmith's hammer, and doing it in a way I can only call endearing. I had walked over that afternoon to collect a mended plow blade for my father, my basket already half full of the season's first plums, and there was Tomas, arms folded, eyebrows raised nearly to his hairline, watching a tall young man grip that hammer the way you might hold a letter you're almost afraid to open. "Wrong end, lad," Tomas told him, gently enough. The young man's face went red under a layer of dust that had clearly been rubbed on, rather than earned honestly, patches too even and too deliberate for real work. He adjusted his grip and swung again, and the hammer glanced off the anvil at an angle that made even me wince from where I stood. It was plain he was new to all of it. His clothes were plain rough-spun wool, the sort any working man might wear, but they sat on him strangely, like something borrowed for a single evening, clean underneath the dirt, a collar that fit a little too well, boots too new despite being scuffed hard at the toe, as if someone had taken a knife to them that very morning just to make them look worn in. I remember thinking, before I knew a single true thing about him, that man is playing at being someone he is not, and he does not yet know how plainly it shows. I said nothing, of course. It wasn't my forge, and it wasn't my business, and my father was waiting on that plow blade with the particular impatience of a man whose whole spring depended on good timing. Thomas introduced the stranger as Art, come up from the capital to learn the trade, taken on thanks to a letter of recommendation Thomas wouldn't show to a soul, though his wife told me later he'd only muttered something about an old debt finally being called in. Art gave me a small, formal nod, the kind that seemed to belong to some grander world than ours. His eyes were a striking gray-blue, the color of the sky just before a storm breaks open, and there was a weariness in them that had nothing to do with an honest day's labor. I would come to understand, in time, that it had everything to do with running. He burned himself on the 5th day. I know because I was there, bringing eggs over to Tomas's wife as I did most mornings, when I heard a shout from inside the forge, not quite a cry of pain, more the sound of a man furious with his own body for failing him in front of others. I set my basket down and went to see for myself. I found him with his palm pressed hard against his stomach, jaw clenched tight, waving Thomas off, refusing to let anyone look at it properly. Men can be foolish that way, and I would learn soon enough that dukes are every bit as foolish as blacksmiths when it comes to pretending pain is beneath them. I didn't wait to be asked. I took his wrist, his skin hot with fever from the burn, and turned his palm up to the light. He let me, which surprised me, because everything about the way he carried himself said he was not a man used to being handled so plainly by anyone, let alone a village girl with dirt still under her nails. The burn ran an ugly red stripe across his palm, already blistering at the edges. "Hold still," I told him, in the same voice I used on my youngest brother when he'd done something foolish with a hatchet. I fetched cool water from the trough and a bit of honey from the bottom of my basket, since honey draws the heat from a burn better than anything the apothecary sells at 3 times the price. And I wrapped his hand in a strip torn from my own apron, since it was the cleanest cloth I had at hand. He watched my face the whole while, not his hand, which I thought odd but didn't remark on. "You've done this before," he said, and it wasn't really a question so much as a careful observation. "I have 5 brothers," I told him, tying off the bandage, "and a father who thinks fire respects him personally after 30 years at it. You learn to bandage fools who believe the same." That made him laugh, a real laugh, startled right out of him before he'd decided whether laughing was even permitted. And something about the sound of it, so unguarded, cracked open a little door in me that I would spend the rest of that year trying to close again, and failing every single time. "Thank you," he said, quieter now, and beneath the formality there was something close to relief, as if being cared for was a rare gift rather than an ordinary Tuesday. "I don't believe I caught your name." "Alara," I told him. "Now get back to that anvil before Tomas decides your other hand needs a matching scar." After the burn healed, he began finding reasons to seek me out, which I noticed and said nothing about, the way one notices a change in the weather before the rain actually falls. He would appear at the edge of our garden rows in the evening, dirt still under his nails that he hadn't quite managed to scrub away, and ask, always a touch too formally, whether I required any help, as though he were requesting an audience rather than offering to carry water. I let him carry my buckets, mostly because watching him try was better entertainment than doing the chore myself. I let him help mend the fence my little brother Tobin had broken chasing the neighbor's goat clean through it, and watched him hold the mallet wrong twice more before 8-year-old Tobin, merciless the way only younger brothers can be, took it from him and showed him properly, narrating every step as though Art were considerably younger than his years. Art took the correction with real good humor, no wounded pride, no excuses, only gratitude toward his small teacher, and that struck me as a fine thing in a man. I watched him learn, slowly and with a stubbornness I found impossible not to love, all the small things any village child of 10 already knew by heart: how to coil a rope so it wouldn't tangle, how to read the coming weather in the color of the western sky an hour before sunset, how to gut a fish without ruining half the meat, a skill he attempted twice and gave up on both times in plain defeat. He was clumsy at all of it, and he never once pretended otherwise, never dressed his failures up in excuses, and that honesty did more to soften my guard than anything else could have. We talked while our hands stayed busy, the way people do when their mouths feel freer for it. He asked me things no one else in the village ever thought to ask, not who I meant to marry or what chores wanted doing, but what I thought about when I was alone, what I wanted for myself, whether I had ever stood at the eastern edge of our fields and truly wondered what lay past those hills. I told him things I had never said aloud to another living soul, not even to my own mother before she passed, and in return he told me almost nothing of himself, always turning my question back into one for me instead, so smoothly that I sometimes didn't notice until I was lying awake that night, realizing he'd told me nothing at all. There was one evening, not long after that fence was finally set right, when a summer storm caught the two of us far past the orchard, too far from either house to do anything but run together for the old drying shed my father used for apples come autumn, and nothing at all in summer. We huddled inside as the rain came down loud enough to swallow speech, and for a while we simply stood there catching our breath, close enough that I could feel the warmth off him despite the chill. He shrugged off his borrowed coat without a word and settled it over my shoulders. A man raised to think only of himself would not have thought of that in the half-second between lightning and thunder. "You're shivering," he said, as if that needed explaining. I told him I was fine, which was another small lie in a summer full of them, because it wasn't the cold at all, and some quiet part of me suspected he knew that too, and was kind enough not to say so. We talked for the better part of an hour while the storm passed, about nothing of real consequence, what I'd name a litter of barn cats, whether the hills looked bluer in autumn or in spring, A foolish old argument he'd once had about the proper way to skip a stone, though he wouldn't say who it had been with. It was, I believe now, one of the happiest hours of that whole year. Simple and unbroken, two people sheltering from the rain with nothing yet at stake between them. I should have been more careful with my heart. Instead, I found myself lingering longer at the well than the water required, staying past the last stitch of the fence mending, inventing small errands, a stray hen to chase, a hedge that wanted trimming just where he happened to be standing. I told myself it was only that good company was rare in so small a valley. I was, for a long while, a very convincing liar to myself, and I have since come to believe that is perhaps the most common lie of all, the one we tell ourselves about the shape of our own hearts. There is a particular kind of memory a woman keeps close in her later years, the kind that has nothing to do with grand events and everything to do with small, ordinary mornings that turned out, without anyone announcing it at the time, to matter more than anything else that happened that season. I think often of one such morning, early in that summer, when my own mother had been gone not quite 2 years, and I still woke some days with the strange hollow ache of reaching for her before remembering. Art found me at the well that morning, with red eyes I hadn't bothered to hide, and rather than ask what was wrong, the way most young men might, embarrassed and eager to move past a woman's tears, he simply sat down on the low wall beside the well and waited, saying nothing at all, until I was ready to speak or not speak, whichever I preferred. I told him, eventually, about her, about the way she used to hum while kneading bread, about the particular blue dress she wore to every gathering because she said blue suited her better than any other color God had made. He listened the whole while without once trying to fix it, without once telling me time would heal what it hadn't yet healed, and when I finished he only said that he hoped, someday, someone would speak of him the way I had just spoken of her. I did not know, that morning, how soon and how strangely that hope would find its way into being true. But I remember thinking, walking home with my water, that a man who knows how to sit quietly beside a grieving woman has already shown you more of his true character than any grand gesture ever could. The trouble began at the harvest gathering, the one evening each year when the whole village crowds together in the square with fiddles and cider and a bonfire, always built a touch too large for its own good, as though we agree every autumn to tempt a little disaster for the sake of good light. Old Merrill, who has never in her life let a mystery lie unpoked, cornered Art near the cider barrels and demanded, with the fearlessness of a woman past 70 who answers to no one, that he dance with her. It was there, lit gold by the bonfire, that the mask slipped for the first time in a way I could never afterward unsee. He led her through the steps of a formal court dance. I did not yet know it was a court dance. I only knew it looked wrong somehow, too precise, too measured, like a swan wading awkwardly through a pond full of stamping boots. His bow at the end came from the waist, held a beat too long, the kind of bow beaten gently into a man's bones since boyhood by tutors, not picked up haphazardly at village weddings the way the rest of us learned it. The square went quiet for half a breath. Muriel only laughed, delighted, calling him our fancy blacksmith loud enough for 3 tables to hear, and the noise of the evening swallowed the moment back up almost as fast as it opened. But I saw his face in that half-breath of silence. I saw the flash of pure fear cross it before he covered it with an easy grin and a joke about a strict old dance master forced on him as a boy. I understood then, with the sort of clarity that only comes by firelight, that Art was hiding something enormous, and doing a poor enough job of it that I, at least, had begun to see the seams. The proof came a fortnight later, on the road home from the mill, when 3 men from the next valley over stepped out of the trees. Men my father had warned me about more than once. Men who drank too much at the Crossroads Tavern and thought a woman walking alone was somehow an invitation. I had my father's old knife tucked beneath the flour sacks in my basket, and every intention of using it if it came to that, but I never got the chance. Art appeared from the trees behind me, having followed at a distance without my knowing, and put himself between me and the largest of the 3 before another word passed.
What happened next lasted less than a minute, and it told me more about him than months of quiet evenings had.
He did not fight like a farmer or a blacksmith. His feet moved in patterns, precise, his weight shifting heel to toe in a rhythm clearly drilled into him since he was a boy small enough to still need a wooden practice sword. He turned aside a cudgel with nothing but the angle of his own forearm, a movement too finished, too elegant, to have been invented on a muddy road that very afternoon. The 3rd man took one look at his fallen friends and thought better of it, and all 3 fled without a backward glance. Art turned to me after, breathing hard, checking my hands and my face with a tenderness that had nothing performed about it. "Where did you learn to do that?" I asked him, once my own heart had slowed enough to allow the question. "A hard life teaches a man things," he said, which was true in the way a locked door is technically still an entrance. We walked the rest of the way home in silence, my basket forgotten between us, until he noticed and took it from me without asking, carrying it the way he'd once carried water, a little too carefully, as though it might report back on him. At the gate he stopped, and for a moment I believed he might finally tell me something true. Instead, he only asked if I was truly unharmed, and when I told him yes, he nodded once and walked back toward the forge, with the straight-backed posture of a man retreating behind a door he had only barely kept shut. I asked him more than once after that, in different ways, hoping some angle might finally open him. "Who taught you to bow that way at the gathering? Why do your hands know a hammer so poorly and your feet know a duel so well? Why, when you think no one is watching, do you sit like a man who has spent his whole life being looked at?" Each time he turned the question aside, a joke, a change of subject. Once even a kiss to my forehead so sudden and sweet it stole the question clean out of my mind for the better part of an hour. I told myself I understood. Every village has men running from something, debts, family, mistakes too large to undo, and I decided, the way a person decides things about someone they've already begun to love, that he would tell me in his own time. I remember one evening near the end of that quiet stretch, my father asking me plainly at supper what I knew of Art's people, whether a girl ought to be careful giving her heart to a man who arrived with no history attached to his name. I had no good answer for him. I only said that some men carry their pasts more heavily than others, and that I trusted Art's heart even where I did not yet trust his history. My father received that with the silence of a man who loves his daughter too much to argue against her happiness, but not quite enough to believe in it either. I asked him once more, the very last time, sitting on the low stone wall behind the smithy, watching the stars come out over the ridge. "If I never ask again," I said, "will you tell me anyway, someday, or will I have to learn it from someone else, the way I nearly learned about your dancing from Mariel?" He was quiet a long moment. "Someday," he said at last, so softly I nearly missed it under the crickets. "I promise you someday." I did not know, sitting under that ordinary sky, how little time someday actually had left before it was dragged into the light by 12 men on horseback, with no interest at all in waiting on his convenience. Looking back now, with the particular kind of hindsight that only comes with age, I can see how many small warnings I chose, quite deliberately, to set aside that summer. There was the afternoon Selah, my dearest friend since girlhood, pulled me aside after church and asked, with more concern than gossip in her voice, whether I had truly thought through what it meant to give my heart to a man with no family anyone in 3 villages had ever heard of, no letters arriving for him, no visitors ever asking after his health. I told her, with the particular confidence of a young woman freshly in love, that not every good man arrives with a tidy history attached, and that some of the finest people I knew had simply appeared in this valley one season and proven themselves through their actions, rather than their pedigree. She did not argue the point further, though I remember the worried look she gave me as I walked away, the look of a friend who loves you enough to let you make your own mistakes, while still hoping, quietly, that it isn't one. I think of that conversation often now. Not with regret exactly, but with the particular tenderness a woman feels toward her younger self, the one who was so certain love alone could smooth over every unanswered question. I was not wrong to trust my own heart, but I have come, in the years since, to believe that trusting a man's character and trusting his honesty are 2 different things entirely, and a woman does herself no favors pretending the second is guaranteed simply because the first feels so very true. It is a lesson I have since passed along, more than once, to my own daughters, sitting at this very table where Arthur now sits most evenings with sawdust still in his hair. They came on a Tuesday, which felt afterward like a small unkindness, that the end of such an ordinary week could hold something so extraordinary inside it. I was in the square with a basket of fresh bread when I heard the horses, more horses than our valley had seen gathered in a generation, and then I saw them, 12 riders in gold-trimmed armor, capes the deep blue of the royal house, moving through our narrow streets like a river that had finally found the crack in the stone it had been searching for. They rode straight for the forge, as though they already knew the way. Art was in the yard, sleeves rolled up in the morning warmth, hammering out a hinge with a competence he'd finally honestly earned. I watched from across the square as the lead rider dismounted and crossed the yard. And then, I will never forget this as long as I live, knelt down in the mud before him. Then, one after another, the rest followed, 12 men in gold going down into the filth of our square for a blacksmith's apprentice who could not meet my eyes across the distance. Though I know he felt me watching. "Your Grace," the lead rider said, loud enough to carry to every open window, "the duchy has grieved you as lost these 5 months. Your mother the Duchess has." I did not hear the rest. I heard only "Your Grace" and "Duchy," and the word Duke landing in my chest like something falling from a great height, and I understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what I had spent these months refusing to see plainly. He came to find me that evening, still in his ruined shirt sleeves, though someone had wiped the worst of the soot from his face. We stood in my father's yard, his guard waiting at a respectful distance, and he told me everything at last, as though a dam long straining had finally given way. His name was Arthur, not Art. Arthur, Duke of Rosemere, heir to an estate 3 times the size of our whole valley, promised in marriage since the age of 4, to a princess he had never once wanted. He had been raised in a house so cold and so watched that by 28 he could no longer draw breath inside its walls. He had fled 2 days before the betrothal was to be made formal before 2 kingdoms of witnesses, taken a false name and a laborer's coat bought hastily off a market stall, and disappeared into the first village that would have him, which happened, by some kindness of fate, to be ours. "I lost you the moment you decided that was your choice to make instead of mine," I told him, and it cost me more to say than anything I had ever spoken aloud, though I meant every word of it. "You didn't protect me from anything, Arthur. You protected yourself." "There's a difference, even when it doesn't feel like one from where you're standing," he asked, quietly. Whether I wanted the rest of it, the smaller pieces he hadn't gotten to yet. And I told him I did. Mostly because I didn't trust myself to say anything else. He told me of a mother who loved him in the distant, dutiful way of a woman raised to believe love and duty were one and the same coin. Of a father dead since Arthur was 12, whose absence had only tightened the household's grip rather than loosened it. Of a princess named Isolde he had met perhaps a dozen times in his whole life, who he suspected wanted this marriage no more than he did, though neither of them had ever once been allowed to say so. He told me he had chosen our valley almost at random, his finger landing on the smallest village on an old map in his father's study, because he wanted, just once before his life closed around him for good, to know what it felt like to be chosen for something other than his blood. "And did you," I asked him, "find that out?" "Yes," he said, without a moment's hesitation, meeting my eyes for the first time since the guards had knelt. "Every single day since I burned my hand, and a girl with flour on her apron decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with any title, that I was worth the bandaging." I said nothing to that, not that night. I only nodded, the way he had once nodded to me on our very first day at the forge, and went inside, leaving him standing in the yard with his silent guard, both of us understanding that something between us had shifted, though neither of us yet knew which way. He offered me everything the next morning, standing in our yard while my father pretended, badly, not to watch from the doorway, a hoe forgotten in his hands. "Land," Arthur said, "a house finer than any in the valley, a place beside him, whatever shape I wanted it to take, wealth enough that none of my 5 brothers would ever fear a hard winter again, as long as any of us lived." He said it plainly, the guards waiting respectfully at the gate, as though this too were simply one more duty of his station. I looked at him, at the man I loved once again wearing the bearing of a duke, straight-backed and certain in a way the fumbling apprentice had never quite managed even on his best days, and I understood that he was offering me a bribe, dressed up as devotion, buying back my trust in the only currency his upbringing had ever taught him to spend. "I don't want your money, Arthur," I told him. I wanted the man who mended fences and burned his own hand trying to prove himself, who laughed like he'd forgotten, just for a moment, that he wasn't allowed to. I don't know anymore if that man was ever real, or only ever a costume you wore because it was convenient, and shed the moment it stopped being so. "He was real," Arthur said, quickly, stepping toward me. "Elara, he was the most real I have ever been in my whole life. Everything before this valley was the costume, this, the forge, Tomas's terrible jokes, your brother teaching me to mend a fence properly, you. This was the first time I ever felt like myself instead of a title someone chose for me before I could even walk. Some quieter part of me wanted, badly, to believe him whole and entire in that moment. But the wounded part of me still needed more than words offered across a yard with 12 armored men waiting politely at the gate. I don't know if that's true, I said, more gently than before, though the walls stayed up. And I don't think you know it either, not yet. Go home, Arthur, sort out which truth is the real one before you come asking me to build a life on top of it. My father found me that afternoon sitting on the back step, shelling peas I had no memory of gathering, my hands working on their own while the rest of me sat somewhere far away, still standing in that yard. He lowered himself down beside me and, without a word, took up a handful of pods and began shelling alongside me, which was, I had learned over 24 years, my father's particular way of offering comfort. You could have said yes, he said eventually, not as any kind of accusation, only an observation. Half the girls in this valley would have said yes before he finished the sentence, title or no title. I know, I said. Then why didn't you? I thought about it honestly before I answered, because I owed him, and myself, a true answer rather than a quick one. Because I don't think he was offering me a life, I said at last. I think he was offering me an apology dressed up as a life, and those aren't the same gift even when they come wrapped in the same paper. My father was quiet a long moment, and then he laughed softly and shook his head. Your mother would have said the very same thing, he told me, word for word I'd wager, and there was such tenderness in the way he said it that I found myself, unexpectedly, close to tears over peas I had already half forgotten I was shelling. He did not come back with more offers of gold, or land, or fine houses. He came back 3 days later, on foot, alone, without a single guard trailing behind him, wearing the very same rough-spun coat he'd worn the day I first bandaged his burned hand, sleeves rolled to the elbow, as though he'd walked the whole distance rather than ride it. Behind him the road toward the capital sat entirely empty. No polished horses, no gold trim, none of it. He had come nearly 9 miles on his own 2 feet, arriving with dust on his boots that was, for the first time since I had known him, entirely and honestly earned. He stood in our yard, and by then half the village had gathered, drawn by news that traveled faster than any horse, my father and brothers among them. Thomas leaning in his doorway, with his arms crossed, and something like pride already forming on his weathered face. Arthur told me, in front of every one of them, that he had renounced the betrothal formally that very week, in writing, before the king's own council and his own mother the Duchess, and that his younger cousin had been named heir to Rosemere in his place. He was, as of that morning, no longer the Duke of Rosemere. He was simply Arthur, a man with some modest savings, a working knowledge of smithing he meant to finish learning honestly this time, and no title left anywhere to hide behind, ever again. I can't give you back the months I lied to you, he said, and his voice shook in a way I had never once heard from him, not even fighting off 3 armed men without a flicker of fear. I know that. I've thought of little else these 3 days, but I can give you the only thing I have left that's truly mine to give, which is nothing at all. No estate, no crown, no guard left to kneel to me. Just this. Just me, whatever's left of me once the title's stripped away, if you'll still have it. I stood there a long moment, the whole village holding its breath around us, and I thought of the boy who couldn't hold a hammer right on his very first day. I thought of the man who bowed like a swan among ducks. I thought of the Duke 12 armored guards had knelt to without a moment's hesitation. And I understood, finally and completely, that all 3 of them were true. All 3 of them were him, woven together so tightly now that there was no clean way left to separate the disguise from the man underneath it. Because somewhere along the way, without either of us quite noticing when, the disguise had simply become another honest part of who he truly was. You're an idiot, I told him, which was perhaps not the romantic line the moment deserved after such a speech, but it made him laugh, that same unguarded, boyish laugh from the forge on the day of the burn, the one that had undone me the very first time, and undid me again now, standing in our yard with half the village looking on. I closed the last of the distance between us myself and let him hold my hand, the one still faintly marked from where I'd once bandaged his, in both of his own, and that, more than any renouncing of crowns or titles, was the moment I finally fully believed him. In the days between his leaving and his return, my father did something I have never forgotten, and never fully told anyone outside our own family, not even Selah. He rode, on his own, the better part of a day toward the nearest town, with a proper inn, where word had it Arthur was staying while he settled his affairs with the crown, and the 2 of them spoke alone for the better part of an afternoon. My father never told me everything that passed between them, being a man who believed some conversations belonged only to the men who had them. But he did tell me, years later, over a cup of tea on a cold evening much like this one, that he had gone there fully prepared to tell Arthur, plainly, that he was not welcome to come courting his daughter again unless he meant it with his whole self, title or none, and that Arthur, rather than defending himself or offering excuses, had simply asked my father what it would take to prove, beyond any more doubt, that he meant exactly that. My father said it was the asking itself, more than any answer that followed, that told him the man was worth trusting after all. A woman does not always get to witness the conversations that shape her future, but I have always been grateful, in the quiet way one is grateful for things learned only much later, that my father cared enough to have that one on my behalf, without ever once asking my permission first. We were married the following spring, not in any cathedral but in our own village square, with Tomas standing witness in his good coat, and Muriel loudly informing anyone within earshot that she'd suspected all along he was secretly a nobleman, on account of that dreadful stiff-backed dancing at the harvest gathering, a claim my father allowed to stand uncontested out of kindness, though we all knew perfectly well she'd believed no such thing until the guards knelt in the mud. There were, of course, harder seasons after the wedding too, because no marriage, however truly it begins, is spared the ordinary trials that come with building a life alongside another person. Our second winter together was a lean one, a poor harvest leaving little to spare, and I remember watching Arthur work himself near to exhaustion at the forge, trying to take on every commission Tomas would give him, determined, I think, to prove to himself as much as to anyone else that he could provide for a family through his own two hands, rather than any inheritance he'd walked away from. I finally told him, one night when he came in so tired he could barely hold his spoon, that I had not married a duke's fortune, and I had not married a martyr either, and that working himself into the ground would not undo a single day of the deception he still, quietly, carried guilt over. He wept that night, the only time I ever saw him weep in all our years together, and told me he was still, even then, terrified some morning I would wake and decide the ordinary life he'd given me wasn't enough after all. I held him until the fear passed, as I have held him through every fear since, and told him plainly that a woman who chose a blacksmith over a dukedom was not likely to change her mind over a lean winter. He believed me, I think, a little more fully after that night than he had even on our wedding day, because trust, I have learned, is rarely built in a single grand moment. It is built in the small ones, repeated, night after ordinary night, until a person finally, truly believes what you have been telling them all along. Arthur finished his apprenticeship properly this time, insisted on it, refusing every offer his remaining family made to simply buy him a forge of his own outright, telling them, with a stubbornness I had come to know as entirely his own, that he meant to earn the trade honestly or not claim it at all. These days you can find him most mornings with soot on his forearms, and that same burn scar, faded now to almost nothing, on his left palm, patiently teaching our eldest son how to hold a hammer the right way round, with far more patience than 8-year-old Tobin had ever once shown him. His mother the Duchess visited once, that first winter, arriving in a far smaller and plainer carriage than I expected, dressed almost modestly for a woman of her station. She sat stiffly at our table and said very little for the better part of an hour, watching her son mend a hinge with a skill that had, by then, become entirely genuine. Before she left, she took my hands in both of hers, an unexpected gesture from a woman who had seemed carved from something colder than warmth all evening, and told me she had never once, in 28 years, seen her son laugh the way he laughed at our table that night. She did not apologize, not in so many words, for the childhood that had sent him running this far to find it. But I think, in her own careful way, that was as close to an apology as a woman raised as she had been raised knew how to give, and I chose to accept it as one. Thomas passed some years ago now, peacefully, in his own bed with his wife holding his hand, and left the forge itself to Arthur in his will, a kindness that still brings tears to my eyes when I think of it. An old man who took in a frightened stranger asking few questions and ended up, in his own quiet way, giving that stranger back an entire life. We buried him in the little churchyard at the edge of the village, beside his own parents, and Arthur spoke at the service, his voice steady until the very last line, when he said that Thomas had taught him more about being a man of worth in a handful of months than 28 years in a grand house ever had. I do not think there was a dry eye among the whole gathering, and I know for certain there was not one in mine. Sometimes, in the evenings, When the light through the smithy door turns gold the way it did that very first day I brought eggs to Tomas's wife and found a stranger failing at his own hammer, I stand in the doorway and watch my husband work, and I think of 12 men kneeling in the mud, and a title he gave away for nothing more than the chance to be ordinary beside me. And I think that of all the things a duke might have offered a blacksmith's daughter, land, gold, a house finer than any in 3 valleys, he chose, in the end, the only one that ever truly mattered. The truth, however late it arrived at our gate, and everything, every ordinary and extraordinary morning since, that came honestly after it. We have 4 children now, 3 grown enough to have children of their own. And on Sunday afternoons our table is loud with grandchildren who have never known their grandfather as anything but the blacksmith of this village, a man with steady hands and an easy laugh and no patience whatsoever for anyone standing on ceremony. My eldest granddaughter asked me once, sitting on my lap with the particular seriousness only a 6-year-old can manage, whether it was true that her grandfather had once been a duke, because Tobin, grown now himself and still merciless as ever, had told her so at supper the week before, embellishing the tale considerably in the telling. I told her yes, it was true, every word of it, and that being a duke had never once made him happy, not the way holding her hand at the edge of our garden made him happy, not the way teaching her father to swing a hammer the right way round had made him happy. She considered this with great gravity, the way children do when they are deciding whether a thing is worth believing, and then she asked whether I had been sad when he stopped being a duke. I told her the truth, which is that I had never once, not for a single day since, missed the duke at all. I had only ever wanted the blacksmith, soot and stubbornness and all, and that, God willing, was exactly what I got to keep. My daughters ask me sometimes, the way daughters do when they've reached an age where they're weighing their own hearts against the men courting them, how a woman is meant to know the difference between a man worth waiting on and a man simply worth walking away from. I tell them what I have come to believe over these many years, which is that it was never the secret itself that nearly cost Arthur my heart. Secrets, I have learned, are a common enough burden for any person to carry, and not every one of them is a betrayal. What mattered in the end was what he did once the secret was no longer his to keep hidden. He did not argue that I had misunderstood him. He did not ask me to forgive him before he had done a single thing to earn it. He simply showed up, again and again on foot, without his guard, without his gold, until the showing up itself became the proof no amount of clever words ever could have been. I tell my daughters that a man's character is not found in how well he keeps a secret, but in how honestly he faces you once it's out in the open air between you. It is, I think, the truest thing I have ever learned, and I learned it standing in the mud of our own town square, watching 12 men kneel to a stranger who turned out, in the end, to be exactly the man I already loved. I still have the apron, the one I tore that first day to bandage his hand, mended so many times over the years now that almost none of the original cloth remains. I keep it folded at the bottom of a chest my father built us as a wedding gift, and every so often, on some quiet evening when the children are asleep and Arthur is still out finishing one last piece at the forge before supper, I take it out and hold it, and I remember a stranger with soot rubbed too evenly onto his face, gripping a hammer like a letter he was afraid to open, and I think that of all the disguises a man might wear to escape the life he was given, the truest one, in the end, was simply himself, the version he had never once before been allowed to try on. There is a photograph, or rather a small painted portrait now, that hangs above our mantel, commissioned some years back by our children as an anniversary gift, showing the 2 of us standing before this very forge, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at some joke Tobin had made just before the painter finished his work. Visitors to our home sometimes ask about it, curious about the fine craftsmanship of a portrait that seems, to their eye, rather grand for a simple blacksmith's cottage. I tell them only that it was a gift from people who love us, and I leave it there, because some stories, I have come to believe, are best kept close, shared only with those patient enough to sit a while and listen to the whole of it, the way I hope you, whoever you are, listening now, have been patient enough to do. A woman my age has learned, above all else, that the truest kind of love was never about grand gestures or golden armor kneeling in the mud. It was about a burned hand, honestly bandaged, and a promise, however late it arrived, kept faithfully every single day since. If there is one thing I would want any woman listening to carry away with her, it is simply this: goodness rarely announces itself with gold or grandeur. More often it shows up quietly, in soot and rough-spun wool, waiting patiently to be recognized for what it truly is,